Welcome, everybody. Today is a special day. We have Dr. Dennis Stover with us, who is incredibly successful in the field of in-situ recovery in the uranium space. And he is here to talk to us today about his background and ISR.
Well, it's good to see you, Janet, and it's another lovely day in the neighborhood here. So,
oh, excellent, excellent. And we find you in your home office. Thanks for joining us. We've known each other for quite a while, and I'm really excited to hear your story. We're on the Mining in America podcast, and yeah, we'll just jump right into it. So, Dr. Dennis Stover, a very accomplished professional in the field of in-situ recovery technology, correct?
that is, I've been involved with in-situ uranium recovery, and as I say, primarily uranium recovery for almost 50 years now. And my involvement really dates back to the first part of the 1970s, shortly after the start of the first energy crisis. When the price of gasoline escalated overnight and there were lines at the pump and everything. And at that point in time, I joined Atlantic Richfield's Production Research Center as a research engineer. It was a time when all of the oil companies, at least in North America, were beginning to very aggressively look for alternate sources of hydrocarbon production, things like oil shale in Colorado tar sands in the Athabascan area, expanded coal production in the western parts of the United States. And I actually initially was engaged to begin working on some research projects dealing with the Athabasca tar sands. But at the same time, coincidentally, we saw the first real growth in nuclear electric power generation worldwide, and particularly in the US. And at that time, the major oil companies, a number of them, as part of this effort to look for alternative sources of energy, recognized that particularly in South Texas, that they may have access to uranium deposits, because the leasing structure for oil and gas in Texas was typically structured as oil, gas, and other minerals. So the leaseor had access to everything, and as a result, Atlantic Richfield, along with Exxon, Mobil, and some of the other major oil companies, began to look at how to extract uranium, both by particularly initially by conventional mining. But what we found in South Texas, where we have essentially several hundred feet of just, if you will, a bucket of sand, no consolidated lack of, if you will, rock mechanics and sufficient strength to justify traditional underground mining, began to look for alternative methods. And one of them was the idea of taking advantage of the expertise of the oil industry, particularly the reservoir engineers, and their understanding of fluid flow in porous media, understanding of fluid flow underground, all related to primary and tertiary and secondary oil and gas recovery. It was a natural fit. And when I was at Atlantic Richfield, shortly after I got there, they were involved with a pilot test in South Texas of in-situ uranium recovery. They were not the operators, but we were providing, my boss and I were providing technical support for this pilot operation. And it was a learning process, and the pilot operation turned out to be very successful. And this was in 1974, early 1975. Atlantic Richfield had an option in June of 1975 to become the operators of the project. They exercised the option and immediately made the decision and announcement that they were going to go commercial, because at that time, the price of uranium was beginning to take off. There was a worldwide recognition that the supply was not keeping up with the demand for the new power plants. So, well, you talk about being in the right place at the right time. all of a sudden we're charged with putting together the technical plans for well field development and the development of the commercial operation. And of course, regulatory requirements were somewhat different then, and we were able to get commercial permits in less than a year. And
Wow.
in the following year, Atlantic Richfield, as the operator, we initiated the Clay West project, which was the first commercial uranium in situ project in the Western world. And we went forward from there. And
Amazing.
yeah,
Amazing.
it was
You
just
know,
an incredible time.
yeah, and so many things are coming to mind, like, the ability to get a permit in a year, the impact that uh, taking quick action did to change uh, the, the process for extracting uranium in the world. So
Mhm.
now, cut away to 2023, 56% of all uranium mined in the world is in situ recovery now.
That's correct. Yes, it is well over 50%. The chemistry or the process varies from country to country. Here in the United States, we have from day one focused on the use of an alkaline or neutral pH um, leaching fluid, or lixiviant as the fancy word is.
Mhm.
Whereas in Australia and in Asia, they tend to utilize an acidic solution. Um, in many cases there, the areas of the reservoirs they're mining in are not do not contain suitable drinking water,
Okay.
or water that could be treated to be potentially made into drinking water, meet drinking water standards. Whereas in the U.S., we deal with sometimes brackish water, but water that's useful for agriculture, at least in livestock. And so we're much more careful about our choice of lixiviants and how we go about it. And
Yeah.
we're required at the end of the operation to return the water to the same use category that it had prior to the introduction of the in situ recovery process.
You know, I want to go into the environmental benefits because they're numerous,
Yeah.
and mining in America, it sounds like there's more environmental benefits because of the lixiviants, the fancy word that you use, that we use here in America. But let's talk about the economics first, because that was something that I understand from my conversations with you, wasn't understood initially, that conventional mines thought this would be good for little projects or little miners, but the economics you were able to prove up very quickly were far superior to conventional mining, correct?
In most cases, but not in all cases. You know, there's
Okay.
some very high grade conventional deposits, particularly in Canada, that are very competitive cost wise. Um, you're right. You're correct in your saying that initially, particularly conventional miners looked at in situ recovery as a secondary mining method. You know, if you can't go create an underground mining operation or an open pit or open cast situation, well, then it's okay. Let's try this stuff.
Mhm.
But that in part resulted from the fact that the academic disciplines involved in situ recovery are different. We're not, most of the people are not characterized with degrees in conventional, as conventional mining engineers. It's very typical. It's an interdisciplinary area. You have hydrologists, you have reservoir engineers,
Mhm.
chemical engineers, process engineers. It's a more diverse field.
Yeah, and to me, that's probably why this came out of the oil and gas industry
Yeah,
instead
absolutely.
of the conventional mining industry, right?
That's absolutely the case. Those of us that came from the oil and gas industry, which were numerous, had backgrounds in the appropriate technologies, particularly as I said earlier, with the understanding of fluid flow underground between wells and among wells, and it fit in very, very nicely. And the large oil companies in particular had existing computer models to deal with how the fluid would move through these aquifer systems.
Yeah, yeah. And an understanding of the fact that it can flow through them, as opposed to the conventional mining, which is more of a remove it and process it outside of the ground. You're basically processing it in the ground in a simplistic way, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the case. There's no excavation here. What we do is we install a series of wells, um, and they're typically very similar or almost identical to water wells that the local rancher or farmer would have for their own sources of water. In that the casing material is probably PVC or fiberglass. The difference is our wells are sealed at shallower depths so that there's absolutely no chance for our leaching fluid to move into any uncontrolled area or unmonitored area.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And the environmental benefits are huge if you're fortunate enough that your deposit will allow in situ recovery, correct?
right, and we should talk a little bit about the characteristics of a deposit that are necessary for ISR. But you're absolutely right. As I said, there's no excavation. We install a series of wells. It's the any disturbance both on the surface or subsurface is temporary. We may within a half a dozen to a dozen years after the mining is complete, the groundwater is restored, the wells are sealed, any issues with surface have been cleaned up and restored, and the land is returned to the original landowners. And as we see in Texas and Wyoming, they can resume their farming activity, the same farming activities, or return to livestock grazing, all the activities they had beforehand. And it's as if we were never there.
So one of the things that I've heard that I've tried to communicate to people about this is the use of groundwater in the in-situ recovery process. Often you're using exempted aquifers, correct? That are already like they've got uranium in them. You can't use this for drinking water. So I mistook that for saying, well, you're actually doing some form of reclamation. But even when you're done, it still contains a lot of other metals that doesn't make it usable for drinking water. Am I correct? That's a tough one, isn't it?
No, to begin with, there are federal regulations associated with the Clean Water Act and subsequent federal legislation that allows certain portions of aquifers to be exempt from any other standards for specific uses. Mm-hmm. And that is what happens in the case of these, in the immediate area where you have a uranium deposit that is located in a water-bearing sand.
Okay.
Quality of that water, as you alluded to ahead of time, is not suitable for drinking because it does contain naturally elevated concentrations of uranium, and it may have elevated concentrations of a number of other metals, simply because the uranium, you have that natural deposit there, and it's active with the groundwater, and some of it will dissolve. So the water it may meet standards, as I said earlier, for irrigation, perhaps, or for livestock. But the exempt criteria, in theory, allows you to not have to return that water to its original conditions. But in fact, the state and federal regulations do require that we return, independent of that so-called aquifer exemption, we are required, and we do in fact, return that water to the same use category that it had prior to mining. Okay. I'm not aware of any ISR operation that's ever actually worked in a true drinking water aquifer. The water quality is very good, but it doesn't, again, because of the existing metals content of the water,
Mhm.
it is not qualified as a suitable drinking water source under federal regulations before the mining.
And I think I get the importance of ISR and in uranium extraction. So uranium went through a real lull over the past number of years. I know you've worked internationally, but why hasn't there been a more of a movement to embrace nuclear? I love that it's happening now, but why did it take so long?
Well, part of the reason, in terms of the development and commercialization of uranium, of ISR for uranium, it's gone hand in hand with ups and downs in the market for uranium. You know, as has conventional uranium mining as well. We've gone through. One of the interesting things was that all of this development was initiated, as I said, beginning in the mid 1970s and through the late 1970s. There was a tremendous escalation in the amount of or ISR development efforts for uranium, both in Texas and in Wyoming, and to a lesser extent in New Mexico. And that was really driven by the fact that the uranium prices had taken off. It had gone from like $7 a pound to $25, $30 a pound, with the expectation that it was going to go to $100 a pound. So both conventional and ISR mining was really a focal point. You know, very similar to what we see going on in oil and gas. Every time there's a big uptick, when oil hits 50 or when oil hits 75 or $80 a barrel, you know, people get pretty excited about it. The same thing here. But in the early 1980s, there were some major uranium discoveries in Australia and Canada, which led to the perception that we were going to be in a situation with oversupply. The price of uranium collapsed. Conventional mining, with the exception of these new deposits that were found, kind of came to a halt, screaming halt. And what happened with ISR was it was really an interesting time because our cost structure came under great scrutiny. And we learned a great deal probably between 1980 and 1983 or 84 about how to optimize, how to minimize operating costs and capital costs. And that really laid the groundwork for the future of ISR being extremely economically competitive and in the emerging industry as the prices once again took off.
And now you're at a very exciting time in your role at Encore Energy, both as the chief technical officer and a director of the board, where this renaissance is happening, and appreciation for the need for nuclear and environmentally and economically solid extraction. Correct?
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's an exciting time. Particularly, we see the pending emergence of these small modular reactors, which provide a whole new source and ability to generate electricity for areas that had not been exposed to, maybe off the major grids and stuff. And the great opportunities there, and worldwide recognition that as we strive to improve on clean energy sources, that nuclear is a key role. You're just not going to do it with solar and wind by themselves, or the limited amount of hydropower that's available. You've got to have nuclear in there for the 24/7 base loads that everybody needs.
Yeah, and you know, and there's a lot of talk about replacing fossil fuels. It's going to be a part of our life, but it's nice to have nuclear as a component of the package. I'm concerned when I see what's going on with the wind farms off of the coast of New Jersey. I won't ask you your opinion on that. That's my opinion, but I see from the non-technical side, the value of nuclear.